I've been meaning to do an SRD that was based around a roll and keep system for a little while now, and today we will get that chance. Hello everybody, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Haskins County for another SRD Talk. This video series takes a look at system reference documents and all the other various engines, dice mechanics, or other add-on materials that a person might want to use when creating their own role-playing game. The particular one that we're going to be taking a look at today is the Tension engine. This was originally published by Gamenomicon, and that's the publisher that you can find the SRD documents under. The credited creators are Will Lintz and Brett Zeiler, and this was originally utilized by the Gamenomicon publishing name for their Party First game, which is a game that's kind of set in the 1980s, has some political overtones, but also has, sort of horror, monster Cthulhu-esque elements to it. There's also been plenty of spin-offs that have been published related to it. There are supplemental materials for it, including, I think, actually a secondary game called The Twilight Wars, which is basically where the monsters are even more real and more prominent in the story. So let's go ahead and dive into exactly what this is. As I mentioned, this is the TTRPG system that was first used in Party First, and it promises, according to the blurb that's attached to the Tension engine document on itch.io, where you can find the document, links in the doobly-doo down below, it promises to again, have a roll and keep system. For those of you who aren't familiar exactly what this means, an example of a different type of roll and keep system was the system that was utilized by AEG in a lot of their games, like the original Legends of the Five Rings games, where you roll X number of dice and you keep a certain number of them, and your success or failure is determined by adding the dice that you keep together. It also promises to have a dynamic tension mechanic, as you can probably guess from the title of Tension Engine. It also claims to have narrative climaxes, rules, light, fast-paced play, and also to be both versatile and accessible. The SRD itself and all of the supplemental materials that were released that are released attached directly to the SRD are released under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, which of course means that you, as long as you credit Gamenomicon and the creators of the Tension engine, as well as stating that your game was made using the Tension engine, basically you can use it in your own published materials. Now, let's go ahead and dive a bit into exactly some of these claims that the SRD has. The first, we're going to be taking a look at, the resolution system itself. Again, taking a look at that roll and keep system, but also how the rules, light, fast-paced play kind of plays out, if you'll mind the pun, in this system. So, as I mentioned, again, we have a roll and keep structure. In this case, what we're doing is both the player and whoever is the opposition, the adversarial character or thing, is going to be rolling individual pools of 6-sided dice, and whoever rolls the highest is the one that succeeds. If a player character is acting, then the player will build a pool based on their character's attribute and skill. Basically, both of these are given a value. So you're rolling anywhere between 2 and 10 dice. You then keep the 2 highest dice, add those 2 dice together. So again, you're probably talking anywhere between 2 and 12. And then, if you rolled higher than the adversary or the environmental roll, which is basically, if you're rolling against anything other than an adversary, you succeed. If an adversary or an NPC, this is basically any type of NPC, is acting, then the game master would then roll a pool based on one of the NPC's stats, and then keep a number of dice, depending upon exactly what type of adversary this is, Basically, the SRD mentions that if this adversarial character is a human, then you keep 2 dice, but if they're a quote-unquote monster, then you should keep 3. Basically, the idea that I'm getting from this is that your standard everyday run-of-the-mill character would always be keeping 2 dice all the time unless there's something unusual going on, like they're using some sort of power or something. But monsters or otherworldly creatures like them would ultimately be keeping 3 dice all the time, just because they're inherently more powerful than humans. As for what stats there are, NPCs are always, instead of being given a complicated set of statistics stats like you see with a player character, all NPCs are only given 2 stats. 1 or 3 stats, really. One is basically their health. Another one is their power, which is for any type of physical attack or basically their physical abilities. And then the other one that you might potentially roll would be their dread pool. So dread is would describe their cunning, so basically like intelligence and stuff, or their otherworldly nature. Occult powers, magic, reasoning skills, all of those kinds of things would fall under dread. If the action has no character opposition, or it's being opposed in some way by the environment, then what the GM would do is there's this thing that I'm going to describe in just a minute called a tension pool. So the GM would roll the tension pool, which again has at least 2 dice, but could have any number of dice in it, and then keeps again the 2 highest dice normally, and compares those to the roll of the player. It's a very basic success or failure. If the player rolls higher than whatever the opposition is, then they succeed. If they roll lower, then they fail. So both the player and the GM actually have a pool of points that they can utilize to do certain special things. As I mentioned, the GM has a tension pool, which, yes, this sets the number of dice that they'd be rolling for an environment roll, but also points from this pool can be spent in order to keep extra dice from a roll. So if I'm rolling and I spend a point, instead of keeping 2 dice, I could keep 3. I could also add the tension pool as a bonus to a roll. For a non-environmental roll. So like if I'm rolling as an adversary. So if I rolled a 3 and the tension pool is 4, then I could potentially spend one of those points and add the dice add the number of dice to the total. So it'd be 7 instead. The tension pool can also sometimes be used whenever you're dealing with a special type of NPC or adversary. It might have special abilities that are triggered by points being spent from the tension pool. The total in the tension pool at the start of the game is equal to the number of players, but it cannot drop below 2. So therefore, whenever you're doing an environment roll, you're always going to have a minimum of 2 dice to roll. The tension pool increases 1 point for each 1 that is rolled by a player whenever a player is doing some sort of conflict roll. So this could potentially escalate pretty quickly, especially the more dice that the players are rolling, therefore the higher the chance that the tension pool starts to increase. So in some ways, you're actually encouraged to a certain extent to try to mitigate the number of dice you're rolling. Also, whenever the tension pool hits some multiple of 10, so 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, the tension pool then explodes. Basically what this does is this sets off a ticking clock that then will trigger something extra bad happening that the GM will start to set up. Normally, it's encouraged that either in the structure of the game itself or the GM prior to the beginning of the game should create like a list of about 6 things that would be very negative, not positive for the players, that could potentially occur, some sort of major setback or some heightened element of danger for the players. That again doesn't really have any positive benefit for the players. and instead, again, sort of ratchets up that tension and the danger aspects of the situation. The players, meanwhile, on the other hand, have their own version of this tension pool called adventure points. Each player has their own pool of player character has their own pool of adventure points. They can be spent to again keep extra dice, just like with the tension pool, and again they can also be used to trigger special abilities. Each character will gain an adventure point whenever their player rolls a 6 whenever they're doing an action. Or also each character's class will also have a special trigger that could potentially gain it extra points. So, for example, there might be a class that you construct for your game where maybe this is a sort of stereotypical sort of healing cleric sort of class, so you might have it so that they gain an adventure point any time, in which case they are helping the weak and needy. At the beginning of a session of a tension engine game, the players will start with 1 adventure point. So there are optional rules that are described in the tension engine manual that dive into a couple of different ways that you could potentially ratchet up these point levels, or different modifications to this that might better fit the particular theme of the game that you want to create. Now, let's go ahead and dive into the anatomy of a character. And again, this is kind of tying into the fact that the tension engine really is intended to be both versatile and accessible. But also, you will see here that it clearly points out the limitations of the tension engine when it comes to like the lengths of different types of games that you could run with this. It really is intended for one-shots or short campaigns, not really intended for really long rolling games. So, as I mentioned, every character has a class. This class will give you certain bonuses to sort of help you set your starting stats. They also, of course, provide a basic description and feeling for your character, and they provide that adventure point trigger that I mentioned earlier. Each character also has 4 attributes, at least there are 4 in the tension engine. Each of these will be a value between 2 and 5. And in the original game, in the original engine, the 4 attributes are described as being vigor, which of course is virality and physical strength, comprehension, which represents the character's mental acuity, so they're increasing in intelligence and wisdom, presence, which represents your character's social standing. Basically, the higher the attribute, the more pull or sway that your character would have with others. And then the last one is discipline, which represents your character's mental fortitude, which of course connects to your character's grounding in reality, your grit, physical fortitude, willpower, stuff like that. So yeah, that's going to be the first of those 2 statistics that will be applying to roles that your character is doing. Again, those can be anywhere between 2 and 5. So if you're doing an unskilled roll, you always got at least a minimum of 2 dice that you're rolling. Skills also are adding into that dice roll. There is a set list of skills that your character would have a value between 1 and 5. Your class gives you a couple of skills at a sort of starting level 1 level, but you get a bunch of points that you can kind of spin the way you want, so that you have the ability to somewhat customize your character even within the sort of class. It's really more like a class and less like a playbook, although you could potentially construct playbooks as a part of this engine. Each character also will have advantages. These essentially are certain special powers or things that your character might have. Oftentimes, you will, in sort of base tension engine, your character will start with 2. One is given to you by your class, and the other one is then picked by you from a list that would be provided by the game creator. So you're going to need to kind of create a list of different types of advantages that your character might have. So an example advantage from the SRD that I'm looking at here is careful, which says when rolling dice in a conflict, you may spend 1 adventure point. During this conflict, the GM may not add more than 1 point to the tension pool. So even if I ended up rolling like a whole handful of ones, the GM only gets one dice, 1 extra point in their tension pool. This particular example requires the spending of an adventure point. However, there are other examples in the system where they're not necessarily requiring an adventure point, but oftentimes they'll require initiating a successful check or conflict roll of some sort in order to utilize the particular power or advantage that it is. One more thing that your class gives you is an ability. Again, these abilities are really strongly tied to the class and the sort of theming of it. So an example class that is included in the sort of expansion that they created that kind of goes with this. One of them is the Warden. So this Warden is again, a sort of like, as you can probably imagine from the name, a very sort of defensive character and protective character. So the ability that they have is called Raise Your Shield, and it says you may spend an adventure point to increase your health and willpower by 2 until the end of the scene. Speaking of which, health and willpower are essentially 2 different pools of hit points that your character has. Combined together, they will always, immediately after character creation, when combined together, the pools will always come out to a total of 15 points. And the health specifically is dealing with like your physical health, while willpower is dealing with your mental health or your mental faculties, and willpower, as it describes on the 10. So yeah, both of those are both acting as pools of a type of hit points. If any of them hit 0, then clearly we've got an issue. Normally, whenever you are fighting against an adversary, as I mentioned, adversaries only really have 2 stats. They have power and dread. Whenever an adversary is attacking a player character and harms them, then if it's a power attack, then it will harm their health, and if it's a dread attack, then it will harm their willpower. So that's another thing to keep in mind, not only for the GM when you are acting as an adversary, but also for the player when you are likewise combating against them, who might potentially be the most vulnerable within your group. Now, as I alluded to, there are a number of hacks and options that are described in the Tension Engine book itself. I'm not going to go into any super deep detail on them, but they do include an advancement system. This is not actually standard. Rather, it feels, at least to me, as a sort of a mixture of experience points and milestones, where again you're getting points for doing certain things. So, for example, defeating a unique type of adversary will get you an experience point in this advancement system, but also other ones are tied specifically to certain story events, like achieving a certain story beat, and so on. There's also in this particular section, as I mentioned, different ways as I mentioned previously when talking about the tension pools and adventure points, there are different ways of dealing out those types of points based on rolls. So for example, I might set up a way where I might gain adventure points or tension points if I willingly include certain dice in my rolls. In the base system that we were discussing earlier, if I roll a 1, I automatically get an event, automatically create a tension point. But instead of having that rule, we might make it so that if I roll a 1, I might gain an adventure point if I intentionally keep that 1 in my pool of kept dice, which of course disadvantages me as a player, might potentially make me less successful, right, in my role, but also could have narrative advantages and consequences down the road. So there are a couple of other elements where you can potentially add statuses, like wounded, frightened, stuff like that. And also there's a morale system that could potentially be utilized in your game, where again, if morale could go up and down, could be spent just like adventure points or whatnot. But if it hits 0, the entire party is defeated. And the number of morale that you start with is just equal to the number of people in your party. So you want to be very careful about that pool and making sure that you're maintaining it at a certain level. Finally, there are also descriptions of certain elements of timetables. These are essentially clocks that form patterns. Very familiar to those of you who've probably played like a Powered by Apocalypse game, but hitting certain elements in the clock will then trigger certain things to happen in the setting, or it might dictate events that are happening in the background, like the actual literal passage of time, or they could be ticking down to something potentially happening in a cyclical pattern and stuff like that. Now, how might you want to potentially utilize the tension engine? Well, I mainly see the tension engine fitting well with, as I mentioned, as I mentioned, because again, the advancement system is not really baked into the game from the start. This is really intended for shorter games where, again, you've got one-shots or short campaigns. I think the system works best when the setting or the theme can tolerate abstract conflict, or even potentially encourage non-violent conflict, but still allowing for combat to happen when necessary. This system is probably one of the better ones that I've This system is probably one of the better ones that I've seen when it comes to not being built for combat, but still allowing it, because of the fact that you have this adversarial role. Because whenever you are engaging in an attack or engaging in conflict, and you roll your dice in opposition to whether it's another player or it's an NPC being run by the game master, the amount above your roll, like let's say if I roll an attack and I succeed, how the difference between the two is how much damage is being inflicted. So it's a very simple. Again, it benefits players that are or actions and things that are of higher skill. It does potentially allow you to utilize non-standard skills in combat without being penalized for it, depending upon exactly what types of things are going on. And again, this allows for a type of conflict that this does allow for non-physical conflict. So, for example, social conflict would be pretty easy to do with this particular type of system. Again, we have the sort of psychic or horror or some other elements to this as well that could definitely, you could see being played out through that dread and the willpower hit points and the dread aspect of the adversaries. Again, because we have these mirrored mechanics for both PCs and NPCs, and it's an adversarial role, this definitely makes it a lot easier if you are creating a system that is at least willing to embrace, if not actively encouraging, PvP of some capacity or another. I'm not necessarily saying that the system is like, obviously the system isn't built for player versus player combat or conflict, but it definitely is applicable, and wouldn't be that difficult to utilize the base structure for doing that, unlike some other games where that would be much more difficult. Again, in this system, we have classes, but we're still giving the player a certain amount of versatility, so it's not necessarily as hard limited as some systems that rely on very structured playbooks. Again, this would be very useful for settings where roles are useful not only storytelling-wise, not only mechanically, but also for storytelling. basically, it would be good to have roles. This system would be good where you do have set roles, or stereotypical roles that characters within this type of story would have. So, for example, let's say the game that you create is some sort of like Ocean's 11, crime drama thing, right? Where each of your characters is like playing one of those stereotypical roles in a team that's going to be, trying to pull off the heist. You're bumbling rookie, you're hacker, you're demolitions expert, you're you're the face of the group, all of those kinds of things. That would be a game where using this type of system would be really useful, whether you're using classes or slightly more structured playbooks, to help you provide that structure for your players, and really make it clear, especially again because this is intended for one-shots or short games, so you're not going to be living in your character for very long. It needs to be quick and easy for other people to understand exactly who you are and what you do. So that's another reason why this would be really useful. Finally, the monsters rule, where you're keeping an extra die whenever you're playing a monster, definitely encourages your game to have two tiers of adversaries. You've got your normal, everyday run of the mill sort of goons you might be beating up, but then you're also going to have the sort of top tier monsters or villains or some sort of seemingly superhuman powered creatures that are going to be, or people that are going to be extra dangerous for our character. So, to say this is a spy movie like Kingsman or 007 or whatever like that, right? You're in that case, you're probably not going to be dealing with like monsters per se, but your main bads, your big villains, like the I can't remember his name, but the dude with the big strong dude with the hat that can like cut things in half and stuff. He would probably be a monster, right? The major bad guys that are helping the villain, they would be monsters. I think the role was originally introduced with the idea of course, allowing you to have these sort of extra supernatural creatures or people with weird occult powers or something, so that you could have the sort of Cthulhu weirdness into it, or that you could have a world where everyone is seemingly normal humans, but then randomly you'll have this vampire or this werewolf or some other supernatural creature show up and end up causing chaos and harm for everybody, that you might need to be an adversary for. So again, two tiers of adversaries existing in your world. That definitely this system encourages it and would be very useful for this type of play. So now we finally come to the question: where can you find this? Well, links can be found down below, but if the links are not working or unavailable, you can also find it on the Gamenomicon itch store. So again, go to itch.io and then search for the user, or search for just Tension Engine and it should pop up. There will be two documents that are listed separately on the itch.io store, under the Gamenomicon itch store. One of them is called the Tension Engine SRD. This is the primary document that we've been discussing today. However, there is a second one called the Tension Engine Additional Classes and Advantages. That one again includes some extra materials that you might want to utilize. So for example, that warden class that I mentioned is in that, and there are a number of other things, not only to give you extra elements that you might want to utilize in your game, but also to give you some extra examples that might be useful as templates for when you're creating your own. So thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for another SRD Talk. I am, of course, Hessen. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and all of that jazz if you enjoyed our video today. Obviously you'll want to subscribe if you want to see any future ones. In the end page, there will undoubtedly be links to other videos in this series, recommendations that YouTube has made for you, and Don't forget to rate your itch purchases and have a good zone.